Dies ire, dies illa, solvet seclum infamilla.
The focus of the previous video was about changes in Canadian cropping systems over time, so from the 1930s to today. Now I'm going to focus on regional or spatial differences in Canadian cropping systems. And to do that, I'm going to first introduce to you Canada's 5 main agricultural regions. This is a map produced by Statistics Canada that shows total farm area as a percentage of eco-district area in 2011. And essentially what you see is those areas with darker colors, a greater percentage of that land base is classified as agricultural land. And areas that are white have no agriculture, no counted agriculture. And this map gives us a pretty good idea of Canada's main agricultural region. There's actually 5 of them, and so let's go through each of them. The first region I'll cover is the one we're living in, or at least the one we'd all be living in if classes were in person. I guess you guys could be anywhere in the world, really. So we have Southern Ontario, Southeastern Ontario, and Southeastern Quebec. And this is kind of the strip of land surrounded by the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. So we have a moderated climate because of that. Quite a humid climate, as you'll see, compared to other agricultural regions. And this is an area where we get enough moisture and enough heat, growing degree days, to be able to grow crops like corn and soybeans. And so this area is what we would also call part of the Northern Corn Belt. And the rest of the Corn Belt extends into the United States. But this is the Canadian part of what we would call the Corn Belt. Again, this region has humid summers, relatively warm summers, and therefore can grow a different mix of crops. So with this more favorable climate compared to other areas of Canada, Ontario and Quebec have quite a sizable fruit and vegetable industry. In terms of total acreage, about half of Canadian fruit production, for example, is in Ontario and Quebec. So this next region you should be familiar with by now. It's the prairies, of course. The prairies are a major agricultural region. It's hard to generalize in terms of crop mix and weather for an area that's so large, right? The prairies stretch from Manitoba to Alberta, so there's quite a bit of diversity within this region. But as a general kind of rule, the prairies would be considered very dry, okay? And so water is a limitation compared to what we have here in Ontario. The frost-free period is also shorter than it is in Ontario, or at least southern Ontario. And so they have a very short growing season, and their winters are very, very cold, okay? So they have a harder time growing something like winter wheat. Very little fruit and vegetable production occurs in the prairies. I mean, it's there, but relative to the size of its total land base and relative to fruit and vegetable production in other areas of Canada, very, very little in the prairies. Okay, and so these factors, it's much drier, their winters are colder, and their growing season is much shorter. Those factors are going to constrain the type of cropping systems that exist on the prairies. The next region is what's called the Peace River Valley, and it spans between the border of British Columbia and Alberta. It's actually the northernmost field crop production area on the continent, and most people have never heard about it, but it's a major field crop producer as well as livestock, particularly beef. Again, this is a northern area, so they have a short growing season. So you have an interesting mix of crops. You have things like canola, spring wheat, quite a bit of hay, and quite a bit of grass seed production. And so when farmers are buying, for example, certified grass seed, seed that's certified free of weeds or a particular species of grass, a lot of that comes from the Peace River area. Again, because it's so cold during the winters and the growing season is so short, they don't have a huge amount of disease or pest pressure that could interfere with seed production. This is just some basic climate data from the regions that we've been discussing, and I think they illustrate quite well, the differences in climate. So, just looking at annual precipitation, we have a lot more rainfall in Ontario. Looking at average temperatures over the growing season, you can see that it's a lot warmer as well. The Maritimes and British Columbia's Fraser River Valley are the other two major agricultural regions I want to touch on. It's hard to generalize about these two regions. They have a very diverse crop mix, so a lot of livestock, field crops, um, forages. I mean, you name it. These areas have relatively long growing seasons, and again are quite humid. And so, because they have warm, long growing seasons, they have quite a bit of rainfall that occurs in the growing season. They have quite a few options in terms of what farmers can grow. These two areas also have pretty sizable specialty crop industries. You can think of, for example, low bush blueberry production in the Maritimes or potatoes, and in the River Valley, the greenhouse industry as well as fruit production, tree fruits like cherries and also berries. British Columbia produces primarily high value fruit. So when you look at Canada's overall farm gate value of fruits produced, so the total amount of money farmers receive for the fruit that he or she sells, about 40% of that value comes from British Columbia producers, primarily in the Fraser River Valley. So, the next part of this lecture, I want to talk about four broad secular trends that are shaping Canadian cropping systems, using, of course, a G by E by M approach, which is what we're taking in this class. So, what do I mean by secular trends? I mean long term trends that are not cyclical, they're not seasonal, they're not flavor of the month, they're long term, consistent trends that are shaping Canadian cropping systems. Of course, from year to year, fluctuations in crop prices are going to affect cropping system diversity, for example. But these are major secular trends that have been going on for 40 years or more. Secular trend the first is the decline in forage production in eastern Canada, excluding the Maritimes, specifically looking at Quebec and Ontario. And so here you have, this is all data from Statistics Canada, tame hay, which I'm using as a proxy for forages in general. The area of tame hay harvested by province between 1970 and 2019. And if you look at Ontario, which is that red line, and Quebec, which is the purple line, we see just an overall decline in hay production. If you look at the Maritimes, it's held steady. If you look at the prairies, so Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, those areas have seen an increase in tame hay harvested area, or at least the maintenance of that harvested area. So it's really only in Ontario and Quebec where we've seen a pretty large decline over the past 50 years in forage. Another interesting thing to note is the sudden decline in hay acreage in 2003, and it's almost complete rebound the next year. This is especially noticeable in Alberta, that yellow line, where we get a huge drop in 2003 and then a recovery the next year. There's a clear seasonal trend going on here. So what happened in 2003? So you guys are probably too young to remember, but it was big news when it happened. There was one cow in Alberta that was found to have what is called mad cow disease. Okay, there's a more scientific name for that, right? But it's eluding me right now. The details don't really matter, but it's a bad disease. You don't want to have it, or you don't want cows to have it. And there's this one cow that did have mad cow disease. And almost overnight, all export markets for Canadian beef products shut down, right? No other country, they all banned the import of Canadian beef products. I mean, they did not want this mad cow disease getting into their own domestic beef herds or harming people or whatever. Okay, so, there was a complete shutdown of the Canadian beef trade export in 2003 for, a number of months, depending on which country, how long each ban lasted. And so in any case, that's, an effect of like a sudden kind of shock. You have a decline in hay production, and then its recovery once those export markets are restored. What you're looking at is a map produced by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada of pasture land as a proportion of total farmland. And this is data from 1996, so things might have changed a little bit in the intervening 24 years, as the previous slide would suggest. But the main thing to note here is that our intensive pasture-based cropping systems are located in the western part of the country. Okay, that's the Fraser River Valley in British Columbia and also the western part of the prairies. There's some pockets in Ontario that are very highly, pasture intensive. You have some areas of eastern and northern Ontario, but again, that's changed over the last 24 years. So the amount of livestock production in a agricultural region is going to have important consequences for the types of cropping systems that predominate in that area. And this is some real world data to illustrate what I'm talking about. So this is data from the most recent census of agriculture, and these are two counties in Ontario: Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry in eastern Ontario, and Chatham-Kent in southwestern Ontario. So Stormont has 4% of all the cattle and calves in the province. Okay, that's there are 4%, 4 out of 100 of those cattle and calves are in Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry County. Conversely, 0.9% of cattle and calves are in Chatham-Kent. Okay, so we have different livestock intensities. And then when we look at the mix of crops that are grown in terms of the proportion of land area in these counties, the livestock intensity is reflected in that cropping system mix. So in Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry SDG, we have quite a bit of soybean grown, quite a bit of corn for grain grown, but we also have quite a bit of hay and also corn for silage. And corn for silage is essentially corn that is the whole plant is harvested and then ensiled for cattle consumption. When we look at Chatham-Kent, we have virtually no corn for silage or hay being grown in that county. Instead, we have corn, soybeans, and to a lesser extent, winter wheat. Secular trend number 2 is the virtual elimination of summer fallow in Canada. This is primarily a practice that was done in the prairies, drier parts of Canada, but summer fallow was practiced really throughout Canada. So what is summer fallow? It's a cropping system practice where you grow a crop every second year. Okay, so one year there's almost nothing growing. It's fallow, that land. And the idea is that in the year there's no crop being grown, you're giving that land, you're giving that soil time to accumulate moisture and nitrogen. Okay, so rainfall that hits that land or snow that melts is going to percolate into the soil profile where it can be stored for a year and then be used by the next crop. Okay, in certain parts of the country there just was not enough soil moisture and rainfall over the growing season to support one crop a year. Now, because there's no crop being grown in one of those 2 years, there's quite a bit of soil erosion that can happen in the fallow year. So, summer fallow is just not a good thing. It leads to erosion, and it's land that could be used productively, produce cash flow for a farmer that isn't. So 50 years ago in 1970, 1/3 of the Canadian prairies were in summer fallow. Okay, that's 15 million hectares. Okay, and that means that you have 2 or 3 Ontario's worth of agricultural land that were just laying fallow in the prairies. Okay, that's how much land was in summer fallow, just a huge amount. And so today it's only about 2.5 million hectares. So again, it's kind of like Canadian agriculture discovering 2 or 3 Ontario's worth of agricultural land by reducing summer fallow. So what happened? Why do we have this major reduction in summer fallow over the past 50 years? So let's take a G by E by M approach to try to answer this question. So first was the introduction of better adapted crops, so lentils and canola, as well as better crop varieties, so improved varieties of wheat that could simply yield well in very dry areas. And so it became economic and indeed possible to grow crops continuously in dry areas where previously farmers relied on summer fallow because of varieties were just not as adapted to these dry areas. So environment has also changed over the past 50 years. There's been, on average, in the prairies, there's more cloud cover, and that means that there's less overall evaporation during the summer. And so, with less evaporation, you have more soil moisture, water in the soil available for crop use to transpire. We've also seen an increase about 10 millimeters a decade on average of rainfall during the growing season. And so again, that just means that there's just a little bit more water, 50 millimeters more water on average in the prairies to support, crop production. So thinking about the M factor, what has changed in terms of management has been an overall move towards reduced tillage systems. Okay, so tillage is used by farmers, for example, to control weeds. There's some amount of tillage or soil disturbance involved in planting normally. But what tillage does, and sometimes that's the aim of the farmer, but probably not in the prairies, but what tillage does is it actually dries out the soil, right? You're taking, soil that's, 10 or 15 centimeters below the surface, you're mixing it up, you're exposing it to the atmosphere, you're exposing it to wind and to the sun, and so you dry out soil. Soil dries out via tillage. And so by reducing tillage, adopting herbicides, low disturbance seeding, no-till technology, by reducing tillage in the prairies, farmers are effectively conserving soil moisture better, providing more water to their crop. So we stay in Western Canada for secular trend number 3, which is that in the prairies, wheat and canola are by far the most important field crops by acreage. I mean, nothing really comes close except tame hay, which isn't a field crop. But oats, barley, flaxseed, I mean, nothing really comes close to the acreage demanded by wheat and canola. Okay, so when we think about the beneficiaries of summer fallow or the reduction in summer fallow, it is these two crops that really take the cake. And it should not be surprising that up until a couple of years ago, canola was the number one in terms of financial value, the number one crop in Canada. It's a different story in eastern Canada, where different crop species have dominated the cropping systems in the region. Here it's corn and soybeans. Okay, canola, very little canola. Wheat is a distant third, and that's winter wheat as opposed to in the prairies where it's mostly spring sown wheat. In 1970s, where this graph starts, oats was actually the number one crop in terms of harvested acreage, but that's declined precipitously. It is really corn and soybean that's dominating the rotation in eastern Canada.